Hello, this is Mrs. Murphy, and today we are looking at My Papa's Waltz, which is in Lesson 5 of your Poems for Practice in your poetry unit on OneNote. I had asked my classes to analyze this poem ahead of the class, and this is a poem which most students tend to interpret in one of two ways. Students will either interpret this poem very literally or very figuratively. And what I want to let you know through this video is that this is not a situation where one of you is right and the other one is wrong. It's not that at all. But in fact, by being able to see both the literal and the figurative meaning of the poem, it adds to the complexity of the relationship being described. And only by reading both interpretations can we fully understand the meaning of the poem. Now, that having been said, if you interpreted it in one way and not the other in your original analysis, that is okay. The purpose of this video is just to enrich your understanding of the poem by giving you both sides of the story. So we begin with the title, My Papa's Waltz. This is a poem about a waltz. And a waltz, as we know, is a particular style of dance or a particular style of music which is meant to complement that dance. And a waltz isn't just any dance, it is a very specific dance. It is a dance where there are prescribed moves that you are supposed to use. And they're prescribed steps. So it's not just any dance, it is a dance that has rules. But it's not just called waltz, it's called My Papa's Waltz. So we know also that this poem is going to be about a parent-child relationship. And we know that there's something about this waltz that makes it uniquely Papa's, that this person's father waltzes in a way that other people don't. And so what we'll see is that there is a literal dance going on in the poem, but that the dance is also symbolic. It also becomes a metaphor for life itself. So, that having been said, let's move on to the literal interpretation of the poem, and then we'll talk about the figurative interpretation afterward. The poem begins, "The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy." Now, first, I'd like to address the fact that I do think that the speaker in this poem is male. And I think that for two reasons. One is the reference to a small boy in line 2, and the other is the fact that the author is male. So the speaker and the author are not always one and the same. However, this poem does seem to take on a sort of an autobiographical bent. And the reference to a small boy makes me think that the poem is written from the perspective of a young man. The very second line, the very second word in the poem is whiskey. And so the fact that the very first thing that the young man says about his father is that his breath stinks of whiskey so strong that it could actually make him dizzy is significant, okay? And the fact that he uses this particular simile, I hung on like death, is also significant. Hanging on like death hangs on is hanging on pretty tightly. So Dad has come home drunk and is waltzing with his son. And so in a very literal sense, taking this poem just at face value of this is what is literally going on, Dad is waltzing with his son late at night, and Dad is drunk. It says, "We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself." So the word countenance may be a bit unfamiliar to some, but it does refer to Mom's facial expression. Okay. And why is Mom frowning? Well, dad has just come home drunk and is waltzing and dancing around the kitchen so um, rowdily, I guess, in such a rowdy way that he and his son are knocking pans off the shelf. So here you did, went and came home drunk and got the kids all riled up before bedtime. The son is supposed to be going to bed, but dad is just dancing around the kitchen like a maniac. So that's why mom is frowning. Dad is messing things up. Pots and pans are going helter skelter everywhere, and the kids are getting all worked up before bedtime. The next line, or the next stanza, says, "The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle." So, what is battered in this case is actually the hand holding his wrist, not his own hand. So, that would be Dad's hand. Dad's hand is battered on one knuckle. This could be because he's working really hard with his hands. This seems to be a hardworking blue collar guy, somebody who does something with his hands. And so that's why they're battered, perhaps. Another possibility would be that he got into a bar fight, a barroom brawl, and therefore his hands are kind of messed up from that. It's not entirely clear. It goes on, "At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle." So, um, if you have ever danced standing on an adult's feet, like I can remember being a little kid and dancing, standing on my father's feet, if he went in a direction that I wasn't expecting, your head bumps into them. And a little kid tends to be about waist high to a grown man. And if dad is this blue collar guy who dresses kind of country and wears big belt buckles, then his son's ear is scraping up against that every time dad goes in an unexpected direction, which dad's rhythm is a little off given the amount of whiskey he has consumed. So that's what's going on here. Um, is this uh, waltzing that is not quite following the prescribed pattern. The next line says, "You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt." So, this palm caked hard by dirt is a clear image of dad's hands. Again, I think he works with his hands. I think he's a hardworking guy. He does something that gets him dirty when he is out at work. And he is physically beating time on his son's head. So, to beat time is to keep time by tapping on something. Okay? So, dad is keeping time to the music by tapping on his son's head with his dirty hand. And if dirt is literally caked on there, it's probably falling off into his son's hair at this point. It says, "Then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt." So the son is hanging on really tightly because he's just afraid of getting knocked over because dad is dancing in such a crazy fashion. So that is the literal interpretation of this poem. However, many students do tend to interpret this poem through its metaphorical meaning. And this is because of the strong diction or word choice that Rothke has chosen to describe this moment. A poet does not choose words like whiskey, death, battered, buckle, and beat unintentionally. And when you put those words together, you get the portrait of an abusive alcoholic father. The idea that belt buckles and belts in general are often used to beat children traditionally, and this poem does date back to 1942, so it may have been a time when corporal punishment was more common. And the idea of being battered, the threat of death, the intensity of the whiskey in this poem are all really significant to its meaning. So while the literal interpretation, literally what is going on is that they are just dancing around the kitchen and acting crazy and goofy together, and that is a fond memory, these words in the background are ever present. And so the hint here, the suggestion, is that this is, in fact, not in this moment, but this is, in fact, at times, an abusive parent child relationship in which, and if you are familiar with alcoholism. Many of us have had an experience with a parent or an adult in our lives who is an alcoholic or an addict. And you probably know that this can make people subject to wild mood swings. And one minute, dad is a happy drunk and he's romping around the kitchen. Another minute, he's not so happy and it becomes angry and threatening and even violent. And the idea that this threat of violence really taints this happy memory. This is a poem about a happy memory, but it is tainted by this underscore of violence, this threatening undercurrent of abuse, which is all too present. So to say that, hey, that's not the literal interpretation of the poem doesn't mean that if you interpreted it that way it's wrong, because it is most definitely there. And poets don't choose words like that by accident. But the full picture, when you put it all together, is the picture of the relationship between a child and his alcoholic father. That, hey, we have fond memories. We have good times. We dance around the kitchen together. We act goofy. But that all those good memories are always tainted, are always underscored by this threat of violence, by this anger and this potential violence that is there. It is very much there. So you're not reading too much into things if you saw that, because it is very much there. And it's only when you put those two meanings together that you see the full expression of this relationship, that children of abusive parents don't just think of their parents in one way. They don't just think of them fondly. They don't just hate them or think of them as an abuser. They have fond memories, but they also have sad memories. And that is the full picture of the poem. Just to point out some of the devices used in this poem, of course, there's a rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme does become more intense. There are more rhymes as the poem goes on. So that tends to cause the reader to pick up speed, just as you might imagine the dance picking up speed as it goes on, because again, Dad's rhythm is a little bit off. The actual rhythm of the poem itself is very specific. If you sort of say the words in a sing-songy tone, tapping out the syllables, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. Every line has 3 beats. If you know anything about a waltz, the rhythm for a waltz is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So the rhythm of the poem echoes the rhythm of the waltz, or the rhythm of the dance itself. The dance itself is a metaphor for life. The way that Papa lived, the way that this father and son danced through life together, is certainly a happy memory, but it's tainted by this underscore of violence. So that is that important second layer that I wanted you guys to see upon further reading of this poem. And I hope that this video has enriched your understanding of Theodore Roethke's My Papa's Waltz. Have a good one.